Jake Morrison crawled through the narrow maintenance shaft with his toolbox in hand, sweat dripping down his face in the hot metal tunnel. The orbital shipyard around Earth buzzed with activity as hundreds of workers prepared ships for deep space missions. Jake had been fixing broken systems for 3 years now, and today felt like any other day until he heard the strange humming sound coming from the alien vessel docked at Bay 7. The ship looked nothing like human vessels with its smooth blue, metal hull and curved design that seemed to flow like water. Jake had never worked on a Zephyrian ship before, but the repair order said they needed help with their environmental systems. The tall blue aliens rarely asked humans for help, so Jake felt curious about what kind of problem they could not fix themselves. He squeezed through the access panel and found himself in a room filled with glowing crystals and strange machines that pulsed with soft light. The air smelled different here, sweet like flowers, but with a metallic taste that made his nose wrinkle. Jake pulled out his scanner and began checking the atmospheric controls, trying to understand how their systems worked. The Zephyrian technology operated on principles that human engineers barely understood, where human ships used metal pipes and electronic circuits. The aliens used living crystals that grew into complex patterns and organic tubes that seemed to breathe. Jake studied the readings on his scanner, noting how the environmental systems maintained perfect balance through biological processes rather than mechanical ones. He was deep in thought, tracing a glowing conduit with his finger, when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Jake quickly gathered his tools and headed for the exit, but the access panel had sealed shut behind him. He pushed against it with all his strength, but the alien metal would not budge. Panic started to rise in his chest as he realized he might be trapped. The footsteps grew closer, and Jake heard voices speaking in the musical language of the Zephyrians. He pressed his ear to the wall and listened as the aliens discussed their departure schedule. His heart sank when he heard them mention immediate launch preparations. The ship was about to leave for a 6-month journey to survey distant worlds, and Jake was stuck inside. He tried to find another way out, crawling through maintenance shafts and checking every access point he could find. The ship was huge, much larger inside than it appeared from the outside, with corridors that twisted and curved in impossible ways. Jake discovered rooms filled with strange equipment and chambers that seemed to shift and change when he was not looking directly at them. The ship began to vibrate, and Jake felt the familiar sensation of engines starting up. He was really trapped now, thousands of miles from Earth and getting farther away every second. Jake found a small storage room and sat down to think about his situation. He had food and water in his emergency pack, enough for maybe 2 days. But the aliens would surely find him before then. Captain Veltar discovered Jake 3 hours into the journey when a crew member reported unusual readings from the environmental section. The tall Zephyrian captain stood over 7 feet high, with blue skin that shimmered like metal and large silver eyes that seemed to look right through Jake. His voice was deep and musical when he spoke in accented English. The captain listened to Jake's explanation with obvious displeasure. He called Jake a primitive creature who had no business on an advanced vessel like the Star Whisper. Other crew members gathered to stare at the human with curiosity and barely hidden disgust. They whispered among themselves in their own language, making sounds like wind chimes mixed with bird songs. Veltar assigned Jake to the lowest quarters on the ship, a tiny room near the engine section where the noise was constant and the walls vibrated. He told Jake to stay out of the way and not interfere with ship operations. The captain made it clear that humans were considered barely civilized by Zephyrian standards, recent arrivals to space travel who had nothing to offer an advanced species. Jake spent his first week learning the ship's layout and trying to understand how everything worked. The Zephyrians ignored him completely treating him like furniture that happened to walk around. He ate alone in his quarters, sleeping on a bed that was too long for his human frame, and trying to adjust to the alien ships. Day and night cycle. During his exploration, Jake noticed things that troubled him. The Zephyrians were brilliant engineers, but their thinking followed rigid patterns that left blind spots in their designs. Their environmental systems worked perfectly under normal conditions, but Jake could see potential failure points that the aliens seemed unable to recognize. Their minds worked too logically, too predictably, missing creative solutions that human intuition might provide. He kept these observations to himself, knowing that Captain Veltar would never listen to suggestions from a primitive human. Jake decided to wait and watch, learning everything he could about Zephyrian technology and culture, while hoping for a chance to prove that humans had value beyond what these proud aliens believed. The alarm started screaming 3 weeks into the journey, while Jake was eating his breakfast alone in his quarters. Red lights flashed throughout the ship as crew members ran past his door, speaking rapidly in their musical language. Jake could hear the panic in their voices, even though he did not understand the words. Something was seriously wrong with the Star Whisper. Jake stepped into the corridor and saw Commander Zixith rushing toward the bridge. The second in command was shorter than Captain Veltar, but carried himself with the same proud bearing that all Zephyrians seemed to possess. His silver uniform was already stained with the blue fluid that served as their equivalent of sweat. The ship shuddered violently, throwing Jake against the wall as emergency lighting kicked in. Through the transparent sections of the hull, he could see space itself seeming to ripple and dance with strange colors. They had encountered an ion storm, one of the most dangerous phenomena in deep space. The charged particles could fry electronic systems and tear a ship apart if the crew could not navigate through it properly. Jake made his way toward the bridge, knowing he would not be welcome, but unable to stay away when the ship was in danger. He found the command center in chaos, with crew members working frantically at their crystal-based control stations. Captain Veltar stood in the center giving orders, while displays showed the storm growing stronger around them. The navigation systems were failing as the ion interference disrupted their organic computing crystals. Jake watched the Zephyrians try solution after solution, each one following their standard procedures perfectly, but achieving no results. Their logical minds approached the problem the same way every time, unable to think beyond their training and protocols. Jake cleared his throat and stepped forward. Captain Veltar turned to him with anger, flashing in his silver eyes. The captain demanded to know why a primitive human was on his bridge during a crisis. Jake explained that he might be able to help, that he had seen similar problems before, and had ideas about how to fix them. Veltar dismissed Jake immediately, telling him to return to his quarters and let the superior Zephyrian minds handle the situation. The other crew members looked at Jake with expressions ranging from amusement, outright hostility. Commander Zixith remained silent, but Jake noticed the alien studying him with curious eyes. The ship continued to shake as the storm grew worse. More systems began failing as the charged particles penetrated their shields and interfered with the delicate crystal matrices that powered everything. Jake could see that the Zephyrians were losing the battle against nature, their rigid thinking, preventing them from finding creative solutions. Another massive surge hit the ship, causing several control stations to spark and go dark. 2 crew members were thrown to the floor as the artificial gravity fluctuated. Captain Veltar's face showed real fear for the first time as he realized their conventional methods were not working. Commander Zixith approached the captain and spoke quietly in their own language. Jake caught a few words that his translation device could handle and realized the second in command was suggesting they listen to the human. Veltar argued back, his pride clearly wounded by the idea of accepting help from someone he considered inferior. The navigation system failed completely, leaving them flying blind through the storm. Without proper guidance, they would either be torn apart by the ion lines or thrown so far off course that they would never find their way home. The captain finally looked at Jake with desperate eyes and asked what he proposed to do. Jake moved to the main control station and studied the failing systems. The Zephyrian technology was incredibly advanced, but also incredibly specialized. Each component was designed to work perfectly under normal conditions, but the aliens had not built in the kind of flexibility that human engineers always included. They assumed their superior technology would never fail. Jake began rerouting power through secondary systems, using backup crystals in ways they were never intended to function. He bypassed damaged components and created new pathways for information to flow through the ship's organic network. The Zephyrians watched in amazement as Jake made their technology work in ways they had never imagined possible. His human creativity allowed him to see connections that the logical Zephyrian minds missed. Where they saw individual systems with specific purposes, Jake saw a network that could be adapted and modified on the fly. He treated their living technology like a puzzle that could be solved through intuition rather than rigid programming. The navigation system flickered back to life, showing their position relative to the storm. Jake quickly plotted a course through the calmer regions between the ion streams, using the ship's sensors in ways the manual said were impossible. He guided them through the churning space like a pilot navigating through dangerous mountains. The ship emerged from the other side of the storm, battered but intact. Emergency systems gradually came back online as the ion interference faded behind them. The crew looked at Jake with new respect, realizing that his unconventional approach had saved all their lives when their advanced technology had failed them. Captain Veltar stood in stunned silence for several minutes before finally acknowledging that Jake had done well. He did not apologize for his earlier dismissal, but Jake could see that something had changed in the captain's attitude. Commander Zixith approached Jake and thanked him quietly, admitting that the human had shown abilities that surprised him. Jake returned to his quarters feeling proud, but also worried. He had proven that humans could contribute something valuable, but he also knew that many of the crew still saw him as a primitive outsider who had simply gotten lucky. The real test would come when they faced their next crisis, and he would have to prove himself all over again. 2 months after the ion storm, the Star Whisper was approaching the outer rim systems when long-range sensors detected multiple ships moving to intercept them. Jake was in the observation deck studying star charts when the alert sounded, a different tone than the emergency alarm that had warned of the storm. This sound was shorter and more urgent, designed to signal an immediate threat from hostile forces. Commander Zixith's voice echoed through the ship's communication system as he announced that they were being approached by unidentified vessels. Jake hurried to the nearest viewing port and saw dark shapes moving against the star field like predatory fish circling their prey. The ships were angular and aggressive-looking, bristling with weapon ports, and covered in battle scars that told stories of previous raids. Recognized the configuration from intelligence briefings he had seen back on Earth. These were Crimson Fleet vessels, the most feared pirates in this sector of space. The Korthic species that commanded the fleet were known for their ruthless tactics and complete lack of mercy toward their victims. They took what they wanted and destroyed everything else, leaving no witnesses to report their activities. Captain Veltar appeared on the main display screen throughout the ship, his blue face calm, but his silver eyes showing concern. He announced that they were being hailed by the approaching vessels and would attempt to negotiate safe passage. The captain's voice carried the formal dignity that Zephyrians brought to all their interactions, even with criminals and murderers. Jake shook his head as he listened to the announcement. The Zephyrians were honorable people who believed in diplomacy and civilized discourse. But the Korthik pirates had no interest in honor or civilization. They understood only strength and violence, and they would see the captain's diplomatic approach as weakness to be exploited. The pirate leader's face appeared on screens throughout the ship, his reptilian features twisted into a cruel smile that revealed rows of sharp teeth. His scaled skin was dark green, with ritual scars covering his face and neck, marks that showed how many ships he had captured and how many crews he had slaughtered. He spoke in heavily accented English, demanding that the Star Whisper surrender. Immediately, and prepared to be boarded. Captain Veltar responded with formal courtesy, explaining that they were on a peaceful scientific mission and carried nothing of military value. He offered to share their survey data in exchange for safe passage, speaking as if he were addressing fellow civilized beings rather than bloodthirsty raiders who cared nothing for scientific knowledge. The pirate leader laughed, a harsh sound like metal scraping against stone. He told the captain that he would take everything anyway after killing the crew, and that resistance would only make their deaths more painful. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the Zephyrians to face the reality that their diplomatic approach had completely failed. Jake watched the crew prepare for battle with growing concern. The Zephyrians were loading their weapons and powering up their defensive systems, but they were doing everything according to standard military procedures. Their tactics were predictable and honorable, exactly what the pirates would expect from a civilized species. The raiders had probably fought dozens of ships that used the same conventional strategies. The first attack came without warning as the pirate vessels opened fire with everything they had. The Star Whisper's shields absorbed most of the damage, but Jake could see that the Zephyrian defensive formations were too rigid and predictable. They responded to each attack with textbook maneuvers that any experienced pirate would anticipate and counter. Commander Zixith was coordinating the defense from the bridge when a direct hit from a plasma cannon sent feedback through the ship's systems. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead, and Jake watched in horror as the second-in-command collapsed with blue blood flowing from a head wound. Medical teams rushed to help him, but his injuries looked severe. More crew members were hurt as the pirates pressed their attack, using hit-and-run tactics that kept the Zephyrians off balance. The raiders were experienced fighters who knew how to exploit the weaknesses of military doctrine and formal strategy. They fought dirty and without honor, using every trick they had learned in years of preying on honest ships. Captain Veltar tried to maintain discipline among his crew, but Jake could see that their situation was becoming desperate. The ship's weapons were designed for defense rather than aggressive combat, and their shields were weakening under the constant bombardment. Several key officers had been injured, leaving gaps in the command structure that were hard to fill. Realized that someone needed to take action before the pirates overwhelmed their defenses completely. He made his way toward the bridge, dodging debris and sparking control panels as the ship shuddered under another barrage of enemy fire. The corridors were filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning crystal matrices. He found Captain Veltar, standing over the tactical display, his uniform torn and his blue skin pale with stress. The captain was trying to coordinate a response using traditional Zephyrian military doctrine, but his strategies were failing against the chaotic and unpredictable attacks of the pirates. Every move he made was countered before it could be effective. Jake approached the captain and suggested that they needed to change their tactics completely. He explained that the pirates expected honorable combat and predictable strategies, but humans had learned to fight dirty when necessary. The Zephyrians needed to abandon their rigid military training and start thinking like guerrilla fighters. Veltar looked at Jake with desperation in his silver eyes. The proud captain was facing the destruction of his ship and crew, and his traditional methods were proving useless against an enemy that played by different rules. He asked Jake what he proposed to do, his voice barely audible over the sound of weapons, fire and explosions. Jake moved to the tactical station and began studying the battle display. He could see the patterns in the pirates' attacks, the way they moved and struck like a pack of wild animals rather than disciplined soldiers. To beat them, the Zephyrians would have to become unpredictable themselves, using deception and misdirection instead of honor and protocol. The ship shook again as another wave of attacks hit their weakening shields. Jake knew they had very little time before the pirates broke through their defenses and boarded the vessel. He looked at Captain Veltar and asked for permission to try his unconventional approach, knowing that the captain's pride was the only thing standing between the crew and possible salvation. Captain Veltar stared at Jake for a long moment while explosions shook the ship around them. The proud Zephyrian captain was being asked to trust his vessel and crew to a primitive human whose methods went against everything he had been taught about proper military conduct. But with his shields failing and his officers wounded, Veltar finally nodded his consent and stepped aside to let Jake take control of the tactical station. Jake immediately began implementing strategies that would have horrified any traditional military commander. Instead of meeting the pirates in direct combat, he ordered the weapons crews to fire at empty space, creating the illusion that their targeting systems were damaged. The pirates saw what appeared to be panic fire and moved closer, thinking their enemy was helpless and desperate, while the raiders closed in for what they believed would be an easy kill. Jake was secretly rerouting power from non-essential systems to create false sensor readings. He made their ship appear to be losing power and drifting helplessly, while actually preparing for a coordinated counterattack that would catch the pirates completely off guard. The Zephyrian crew watched in confusion as Jake ordered them to dump cargo containers into space, making it look like they were jettisoning valuable materials in a desperate attempt to buy mercy from the attackers. But Jake had secretly filled the containers with modified sensor probes that would create electromagnetic interference and confuse the pirates. Targeting Systems. Jake then ordered the engineering teams to begin what appeared to be an emergency shutdown of the main engines. The pirates interpreted this as a sign of surrender and moved in closer, their ships forming an attack formation that would normally guarantee victory. But Jake was actually setting a trap that would turn their aggressive positioning into a weakness. When the lead pirate vessel came within optimal range, Jake triggered his carefully planned counterattack. The Star Whisper suddenly came alive. With full power, its weapon systems targeting the surprised raiders with devastating accuracy. The containers Jake had jettisoned earlier exploded in coordinated bursts, creating a web of electromagnetic chaos that disrupted the pirates' formation. The Zephyrian crew executed Jake's unconventional battle plan with growing enthusiasm as they saw how effective his deceptive tactics could be. They used their maintenance equipment as improvised weapons, launching clouds of metallic debris that confused enemy sensors and masked their true position. Jake had turned their peaceful scientific vessel into a ghost ship that struck from unexpected angles. The pirates found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to follow any rules they understood. Every time they thought they had the Star Whisper cornered, the ship would disappear into a cloud of sensor interference and emerge somewhere else entirely. Jake was using the debris field he had created as cover, striking quickly and then vanishing. Before the raiders could respond effectively, Jake coordinated the defense from multiple stations, his human ability to multitask and think creatively giving him advantages that the rigid Zephyrian training had never developed. He kept the pirates guessing by constantly changing tactics, never letting them settle into a predictable pattern that their experienced fighters could counter. The first pirate ship fell when Jake lured it into chasing what appeared to be a damaged shuttle, only to have it fly directly into a trap where the Star Whisper's main weapons were waiting. The explosion lit up the battlefield as the raider vessel broke apart, its destruction sending a message to the other pirates that this would not be the easy victory they had expected. Jake pressed his advantage by immediately targeting the command ship where the pirate leader was coordinating the attack. He used every dirty trick he could think of, jamming their communications with feedback loops and flooding their sensors with false information. The raiders were fighting blind, while Jake could see everything they were doing. The second pirate vessel tried to ram the Star Whisper in a desperate kamikaze attack, but Jake was ready for the suicide run. He used the ship's tractor beams in reverse, pushing the attacking vessel off course and sending it spinning into the debris field where it was torn apart by its own momentum. The Zephyrian crew cheered as another enemy ship died in flames. Captain Veltar watched the battle with growing amazement as Jake demonstrated tactical abilities that surpassed anything in Zephyrian military doctrine. The human was thinking several moves ahead of the pirates, anticipating their responses and preparing counters for strategies they had not even decided to use yet. His unconventional approach was proving devastatingly effective. The remaining pirates began to retreat as they realized they were being outfought by what they had assumed be helpless prey. But their withdrawal was not fast enough to save the command ship, which Jake had been systematically isolating and weakening throughout the battle. The pirate leader's vessel found itself alone and surrounded, cut off from any possible escape route. Jake opened a channel to the enemy commander and offered him the same choice the pirate had given to Captain Veltar earlier. He could surrender immediately or be destroyed along with his ship and crew. The reptilian raider's face showed shock and rage as he realized that a human had outmaneuvered his experienced fighters, using tactics he had never encountered before. Pirate leader tried one final desperate attack, firing everything he had at the Star Whisper while screaming curses in his native language. But Jake had anticipated this last burst of violence and was ready with a response that ended the threat permanently. The command ship exploded in a brilliant flash that left only wreckage drifting in space during the final moments of the battle. A piece of debris struck the bridge and sent Captain Veltar crashing to the floor. The Zephyrian captain's head hit a control console with sickening force, and blue blood began pooling beneath his unconscious form. Medical teams rushed to help him, but his injuries looked serious enough to keep him out of action for days or weeks. Lieutenant Commander Nixara looked around the damaged bridge at the wounded officers and disabled systems. The ship needed immediate leadership to deal with the aftermath of the battle and continue their mission. She turned to Jake, who was still coordinating damage control efforts from the tactical station, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. She formally requested that Jake assume temporary command of the Star Whisper until Captain Veltar recovered from his injuries. The other surviving officers nodded their agreement, having witnessed Jake's superior tactical thinking under pressure. The human who had been dismissed as a primitive stowaway was now being asked to lead one of the most advanced ships in the Zephyrian fleet. Jake stood on the bridge of the Star Whisper, looking out at the debris field that marked their victory over the Crimson Fleet, but he felt no celebration in his heart. The ship was badly damaged, with hull breaches on 3 decks and critical systems failing throughout the vessel. Captain Veltar remained unconscious in the medical bay with severe head trauma, and the crew was looking to Jake for leadership in their darkest hour. Lieutenant Commander Nixara approached him with a data pad containing damage reports from every section of the ship. Her silver eyes showed respect that had been completely absent when Jake first came aboard as an unwelcome stowaway. She explained that they had lost main engine power and their navigation systems were operating at only 30% efficiency. The ship could barely maintain life support, much less continue their scientific mission. Jake studied the reports and realized that their situation was more desperate than he had initially thought. They were deep in hostile territory, with limited resources and no way to contact Zephyrian command for assistance. The pirates they had defeated were just one small part of a larger criminal network that controlled this entire sector of space. More raiders would come looking for their missing comrades. The crew watched Jake carefully as he moved through the ship, inspecting the damage and talking to repair teams. The Zephyrians had never served under human leadership before, and they were uncertain about how to respond to his orders. Their rigid hierarchy had always placed them above humans in status and authority, but the battle had proven that Jake possessed abilities their own officers lacked. Jake realized that he needed to change more than just their tactics if he wanted to earn their complete loyalty and trust. The Zephyrian command structure was based on rank and tradition rather than merit and effectiveness. Officers gave orders without explanation, while subordinates followed them without question, a system that worked well in normal circumstances, but failed under extreme pressure. He began implementing human leadership principles that initially confused and worried the alien crew. Jake encouraged suggestions from all crew members, regardless of their rank or position, asking for input from maintenance workers and junior officers who had never been consulted about important decisions. He also made sure to explain his reasoning when giving orders, helping everyone understand how their individual contributions fit into the larger plan. The Zephyrians were surprised when Jake began visiting wounded crew members in the medical bay, checking on their condition and thanking them personally for their service during the battle. Their previous commanders had maintained dignified distance from subordinates, but Jake showed genuine concern for individuals that touched something deep in their hearts. They began to see him not just as a tactical leader, but as someone who truly cared about their welfare. Jake's leadership style proved its worth when they detected an emergency distress signal coming from a nearby system. A civilian transport carrying refugees from a recent planetary disaster was under attack by the same pirate fleet they had just defeated. The surviving raiders had found easier prey and were preparing to slaughter innocent families who had already lost everything. The crew gathered on the bridge to discuss their options, but many of them argued for avoiding the situation entirely. The Star Whisper was barely functional and had no business engaging in another battle when they could barely defend themselves. Lieutenant Commander Nick Zara pointed out that their duty was to complete their scientific mission, not to play rescue ship for every vessel in distress. Jake listened to all their arguments before making a decision that tested everything he had tried to teach them about leadership and courage. He announced that they would intercept the pirate attack and defend the civilian transport, regardless of the risks to their own mission and safety. The bridge fell silent as the crew realized their human commander was willing to sacrifice everything to save strangers. Some of the officers protested that Jake was being reckless and emotional, letting human sentiment override logical thinking. They argued that saving one transport full of refugees was not worth risking the lives of everyone on the Star Whisper and the failure of their important scientific expedition. The debate grew heated as Zephyrian logic clashed with human compassion. Jake stood firm in his decision and explained that true leadership meant making difficult choices based on moral principles rather than cold calculations. He told them that the measure of a civilized species was not their technology or their scientific achievements, but their willingness to help others even when it cost them dearly. The refugees needed their help, and Jake would not abandon innocent people to save his own skin. His speech had a profound effect on the crew as they began to understand what Jake was really asking of them. He was not just requesting that they risk their lives in battle, but that they choose to become the kind of people who would always stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The decision would define who they were as individuals. And as a crew, Lieutenant Commander Nick Zara was the first to voice her support for Jake's plan, followed quickly by the other surviving officers. The crew rallied behind their human commander with enthusiasm that surprised even Jake himself. They began working together with new energy and purpose, united by a shared commitment to do the right thing even when it seemed impossible. Jake coordinated the rescue mission from the bridge, while repair teams worked frantically to restore critical systems. They had less than 2 hours to prepare for another battle against an enemy that would be expecting them this time. The pirates would not fall for the same tricks that had worked before, and the Star Whisperer was in much worse condition than during their previous encounter. The ship limped toward the battle zone with engines running on backup power and weapons. Systems barely functional. Jake knew they were heading into a fight they could not win through conventional means, but he also knew that his crew now believed in something bigger than themselves. They were no longer just following orders from a superior officer, but fighting for principles that gave meaning to their sacrifice. As they approached the coordinates where the civilian transport was under attack, Jake felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The lives of everyone on both ships now depended on his ability to find another miracle when their resources were nearly exhausted. He looked around the bridge at faces that trusted him completely and hoped he would prove worthy of their faith. The rescue mission began badly when the Star Whisperer emerged from hyperspace to find the civilian transport already surrounded by 4 pirate vessels. The refugee ship was a converted cargo hauler with minimal shields and no weapons carrying over 300 families who had fled their dying homeworld with nothing but hope for a better future. Jake could see escape pods launching from the transport as the pirates moved in for the final attack. Jake knew his damaged ship could not defeat 4 pirate vessels in direct combat, but he also knew that the raiders would not expect him to attack at all. The Star Whisperer appeared to be barely functional, with power fluctuations visible along its hull and debris still clinging to its damaged sections. The pirates would assume it posed no threat until it was too late for them to respond effectively. He ordered his crew to begin broadcasting a fake distress signal while secretly positioning the ship for a surprise attack on the pirate formation. Jake had learned from their previous battle that the raiders relied on fear and intimidation rather than careful tactics, which made them vulnerable to unexpected moves from an apparently helpless opponent. The first part of Jake's plan worked perfectly as the pirates ignored the approaching Star Whisperer and continued their assault on the defenseless transport. They were focused on easy prey and did not notice the subtle maneuvers that brought the Zephyrian vessel into optimal firing position. Jake waited until the last possible moment before revealing his true intentions. The Star Whisperer opened fire with everything it had, concentrating all its remaining power into a devastating attack that caught the nearest pirate ship completely by surprise. The raider vessel exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the darkness of space, sending wreckage spinning into the paths of its companion ships and disrupting their careful formation. But Jake's tactical brilliance came at a terrible cost as the overloaded weapons systems began failing throughout the ship. Emergency alarms sounded as power conduits overheated and crystal matrices cracked under the strain of operating beyond their design limits. The Star Whisperer had traded its future for one perfect moment of destruction. The remaining pirates recovered quickly from their initial shock and turned their full attention to the ship that had just destroyed their companion. Jake found himself facing 3 angry enemies with weapons that were barely functional and shields that flickered on and off like dying stars. The rescue mission was turning into a suicide attack that would save no one. Lieutenant Commander Nick Zara coordinated damage control efforts while Jake tried to keep the pirates at bay using the few working systems they had left. The crew worked with desperate efficiency to restore power to critical systems, but they were fighting a losing battle against cascading failures that threatened to leave them dead in space. The transport ship managed to escape during the confusion of battle, its captain sending grateful messages to the Star Whisperer as the refugee vessel limped toward safety. Jake felt satisfaction knowing that 300 innocent families would live to see another day, even if his own crew paid the ultimate price for their heroism. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, reinforcements arrived in the form of a Va, Zephyrian patrol squadron that had been investigating reports of pirate activity in the sector. The 5 military vessels made short work of the remaining raiders, their advanced weapons and coordinated tactics overwhelming the criminals who had terrorized this region of space for too long. Captain Veltar awakened in the medical bay just as the battle ended, his head wrapped in bandages, but his silver eyes clear and focused. He listened to reports of what had happened during his unconsciousness with growing amazement and pride. His human engineer had not only saved the ship, but had inspired the crew to become something better than they had ever been before. The rescued transport carried representatives from 6 different species, all of whom had witnessed Jake's courage and competence during the desperate rescue mission. Word spread quickly through the refugee community about the human who had risked everything to save strangers, creating a legend that would travel to every corner of the galaxy. When they returned to Zephyrian space, Jake faced a military tribunal, investigating his assumption of command during the crisis. The formal hearing was conducted with all the ceremony and tradition that the Zephyrians brought to important occasions. But Jake could see that the outcome had already been decided by the testimony of his crew and the rescued civilians. Captain Veltar spoke eloquently about Jake's tactical genius and moral courage, describing how the human had saved not only their lives, but their souls by teaching them what true leadership really meant. Lieutenant Commander Nick Sara and the other officers confirmed every detail of his testimony, their voices filled with respect and gratitude for the man who had transformed them from a collection of individuals into a unified crew. The tribunal's decision was unanimous and unprecedented in Zephyrian military history. Jake Morrison was granted the rank of captain and offered command of a new experimental vessel designed to foster cooperation between different species. The Unity's Dawn would be crewed by volunteers from across the galaxy, united under the leadership of the human who had proven that merit more than origin. Jake accepted the promotion with humility and determination, knowing that his real work was just beginning. The story of his adventures aboard the Star Whisper had already spread throughout known space, inspiring other humans to seek positions on alien vessels, and proving that humanity had valuable contributions to make in a diverse galaxy. The final ceremony took place on the bridge of the Unity's Dawn, as Jake assumed command of his new ship and crew. Representatives from dozens of species attended the historic event, watching as a former maintenance engineer became the first human to command a multi-species starship. The assembled crowd included many of the refugees he had saved, their presence a reminder of why his leadership mattered. Jake looked out at the stars through the bridge viewports and thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as an accidental stowaway trapped on an alien vessel, dismissed and ignored by beings who considered themselves superior to humanity. Now he stood as proof that courage and creativity could overcome any prejudice or limitation. Veltar approached Jake and formally transferred command of the Unity's Dawn with words that honored both their friendship and their mutual respect. The Zephyrian captain had learned that true leadership came not from species or tradition, but from the willingness to sacrifice for others and inspire them to be their best selves. As the ceremony concluded and the gathered crowd dispersed, Jake remained on the bridge with his new crew of humans, Zephyrians, and other species who had volunteered to serve under his command. They represented a new era in galactic relations, where cooperation replaced competition and understanding, bridged the gaps between different worlds and cultures. The Unity's Dawn departed on its maiden voyage with Jake Morrison at the helm, carrying the hopes and dreams of countless beings who believed that the future belonged to those brave enough to work together despite their differences.